of Mouth is an adult story time presented by the Juliet Hampton Morgan Memorial Library. My name is Amy Campbell, and today I'll be reading The Ghastly Bird and Murder at the Grand Hotel. If you enjoy today's program, we meet every second Sunday in the Montgomery Room at 2:30 p.m. This program is being recorded live and will be posted at a later date for you to enjoy again on our YouTube and Facebook pages. As a reminder, some stories contain adult language and content. It is recommended you review stories before allowing younger audiences to listen. This is The Ghastly Bird by Nnedi, Okorafor. Dodo, the fat gray bird said, taking a tentative step toward Zev. It stood on the other side of the yard, the side where Zev's gardeners worked the hardest because they had to not only pull weeds, but also to keep the jungle behind the fence from invading Zev's well-kept space. The plump bird had a large, hooked beak, and when it turned to the side, Zev could see a plume of white feathers adorning its tail. Zev dropped the large glass of beer that he held in his hand. He didn't drop his binoculars, which he held in his other hand. He brought them to his eyes. It was a beautiful, sunny day on the island of Mauritius, the kind of day in which only good things happen. But even on this day, Zev never imagined that his dream would come true. Zev had a rare day off. Usually he was lecturing at the university, grading exams, typing up his latest scholarly paper, or in the bush searching for birds to photograph and classify. Today, Zev had huffed and puffed as he dragged his lounge chair to the center of his green, short-grassed lawn, away from the shade of his perfectly manicured coconut, guava, mango, and banyan trees. He'd plopped down with his second glass of beer, the lounge chair creaking loudly under his heavy weight. He was fully prepared to inhale the smells of the roses, lilies, and lilacs in his flower garden and watch the birds visit his cornucopia of bird feeders hanging from his calvaria tree. Some feeders were filled with seeds, others with dried fruit, and some he'd put fresh mealworms in this morning. The calvaria tree added its own fruit to the feast, to Zev's delight. This extremely rare tree had cost Zev thousands to obtain, and even more to maintain. Now, not only was it healthy, but it was so healthy that it was dropping its thick-coated, fuzzy brown fruits all over the lawn beneath it. Zev had been planning to remind his gardeners to clean up the fruity mess, but now he was glad he'd procrastinated. Look who had come to visit him. Zev was familiar with many of the birds. One of the regulars was the clumsy white egret that often crash-landed into Zev's lawn. This bird liked to eat the mealworms. It was there now, happily snapping up worm after worm. Warblers, doves, and pigeons, parakeets, mynah birds, crows. One parrot that had been visiting his feeders for years would even land on Zev's shoulder and take sunflower seeds from Zev's lips. Watching and interacting with the birds usually relaxed every bone in his body. Now, however, he was anything but relaxed. He was so excited that his heart palpitated, and he had to breathe through his mouth. However, his hands were steady. He'd been preparing for this moment all his life. He bit his bottom lip hard and snickered to himself. He'd rather have thrown his head back and guffawed loudly enough to shake the skies. But he didn't want to scare this bird away. No, that would break his heart. This was his moment. He felt that now he could die a happy man. Ah, look at that beak, he whispered, his eyes starting to feel dry from not blinking, sweat trickling through the hairs of his armpits. It really does feed on the fruit of the calvaria tree. Round body, plume of white feather on the tail. Oh, I just knew it, it's all correct. He was overcome again with shakes from stifling his snickers. After all these years, it was true, as he had always believed. It wasn't a certainty he discussed with his fellow colleagues at the university. Zev wasn't stupid. For an ornithologist to believe that the dodo was not extinct and to be open and adamant about it would first get him ostracized and then quietly fired. Still, Zev believed what he believed, and he was a hard-headed man. so no one could change that. The dodo wasn't the stupid idiot bird that those Europeans like to portray it as. No, it was simply friendly. There had been no humans on this island. Why would it have a fear of them? But though they were friendly, dodos were smart, Zev believed. It only made sense. In Zev's books, the dodo was known for being extremely stupid. Some called it an inflated pigeon. Others just said it was more like a clumsy turkey. In their travelogues, explorers boasted about being able to run circles around the bird, even when they were extremely drunk. Then they would bop the bird on the head and cook it up for dinner. Then they complained about how no matter what they did to the dodo meat, it remained tough and tasteless as an old shoe. Thus, it gained another nickname, the Ghastly bird. Before men brought their boats, disease, and foreign beasts, the dodo had no predators. Or maybe it was too smart to be prey, Zev thought. They lived in the forests with competence. They'd lay their one large egg in a nest on the ground in the middle of the forest and be sure that their egg was safe. But when men came with his unfamiliar dogs, pigs, and ship rats, the dodo and their nests had no chance. But the dodo couldn't possibly be as stupid as it looked. They must have a secret, Zev believed. A hiding place that not even man could find. Or magical powers. Or maybe they could disappear and reappear at will. Or during certain parts of the night they could fly without needing to flap their tiny wings. The dodo wasn't some overweight, dopey-looking creature. That was just a costume. Once or twice he'd let this fantasy surface in conversation with his girlfriend, Serafina. When his passion for the subject showed, she laughed in his face and rolled her eyes and said, "I think something is very wrong with you, Zev." She'd broken up with him weeks ago. He'd really liked Serafina. It tore his heart that a belief he held so close to his soul would cause her to leave him. So he pushed it into the back of his mind and got on with his research, his lectures, his life work. He loved birds, so this was not very difficult. So what if he remained a bachelor all his life? Even if he had married her, he'd have never shown Serafina the cabinet in the corner of his bedroom where he kept a shrine dedicated to his favorite living bird, the dodo. In it, there were plaster and wooden carvings of dodos. He had a tiny figurine of the bird made of hummingbird feathers, a large, expensive porcelain dodo encrusted with chips of glass, and several stuffed toy dodos. He even had a dodo doll that he slept with at night, when none of his girlfriends slept over, of course. He'd collected dodo trinkets since he was a child growing up in India. At the age of 35, he had been a highly sought-after professor of ornithology. He could have gone anywhere, but it was Mauritius that he wanted to travel to, the home of the dodo. And now, almost 20 years later, he still felt he couldn't have made a better decision. Mauritius was not only beautiful, there was also a healthy Hindi population that reminded him of home when he needed it, and an even healthier variety of birds. He wouldn't have been happier anywhere else in the world. He brought down his binoculars so that he could see the dodo with his own naked eyes. 3 dainty mourning doves were battling for seeds under one of the bird feeders, but Zev only looked at the dodo. The dodo was looking at him too, which made his heart beat even faster. Then it turned around in its lumbery way and ran back into the bushes. "Wait, please," Zev said, but only quietly. It had eaten here. It would be back. Zev just sat there, his heartbeat slowing back to normal. Still, there was excited sweat on his brow, and his mouth twitched into a giddy grin. He giggled, feeling utterly tickled inside. Then he slapped the side of his face and giggled some more. He didn't know what to do. He didn't want to move, that he knew. If he moved, the moment would be over. But there will be other moments, he thought to himself. He was sure the dodo bird would come back, at least once, and he had to be there to see it, maybe even lure it up close with an especially juicy calvaria tree fruit. I should get my camera. He waited for a moment and then suddenly jumped up. The longer he waited, the sooner the dodo would return. Get camera. And he had to empty his bladder. He ran into the house. There was a bathroom that had a small window facing the backyard. He'd be able to look out the window from there to make sure the dodo didn't return without him. He ran fast, his binoculars bumping against his large belly, tripping over the step into the house, but quickly regaining his footing with a gasp for air. He threw the bathroom door open and unzipped his pants as he looked out the window. As he urinated, he squinted. Then he gasped, "Shit!" He wasn't sure what to do. He wasn't finished, but from where he stood, he could see it. The dodo emerged from the spot in the bushes where it had disappeared, back under the calvaria tree. Zev directed his stream of urine with one hand and grabbed his binoculars with the other hand. The moment he got the bird into view, the bird stopped eating and looked directly at him. "Oh," Zev said, his eyebrows rising. He was so excited that he could hear his heartbeat in his ears. He shook himself off and zipped up his pants. He didn't bother flushing the toilet when he left the bathroom. Forget the camera. No time. He'd left the back door open so he didn't worry about scaring it away with the sound of the sliding door. Now all he had to do was walk slowly and quietly toward the bird. He knew he could do that. He was a pro at approaching birds. He believed that he had a special ability to mentally calm the birds with his presence, be it finch, parrot, secretary bird, or grackle. Very few birds ever fled from his presence. Even now, as he slowly walked across the yard, sweat pouring from his brow, breathing heavily with excitement, none of the birds at the feeder paid any attention to him. It was as if he was only partially there. He smiled to himself. No other ornithologist in his department would be able to touch him, and all his past girlfriends had been too shallow to see how good he was at what he did. The dodo hadn't moved as it watched Zev approach. All around him the world was bright and alive. The air smelled of leaves, flowers, fertile earth soaked by the ocean. He could hear the cars and trucks driving by, and people houses away having conversations. He paused for a moment and frowned. One of those voices sounded like his mother. He would call her today and tell her what he saw. Then he'd tell his father. Then he'd call that woman Serafina and tell her if she hung up the phone, he'd call her back and tell her again. He'd take pictures and show them to his department colleagues. His research and photos would appear in the top scientific journals. He'd make the cover of international magazines. He would be the expert on dodos. He was the expert. All this he thought about as he approached the staring, robust bird. 5 yards, 2 yards, 1.5 yards. Still, it didn't move. It was beautiful. So beautiful that Zev felt weak with joy. 2 feet away from the dodo, Zev knelt down on the ground and lay before the bird. He could see now that its eyes were black with flecks of gold and green. He was wheezing as he watched the bird slowly amble up to him. He could feel his heart laboring in its last throes as the world around him grew more clear and pungent. Now all he could smell were flowers, oily with sweetness, not his lilacs, lilies, or roses, some other types of blossoms. He rolled onto his side as the dodo spirit guide stepped to him. "Dodo?" it cooed again, softly. Zev smiled as the dodo bent its soft head and rested it on his cheek. Then Zev knew no more. This is Murder at the Grand Hotel. Gordon B. Pumps whacked at the bamboo in the canebrake as if he were possessed. He saw in each whack of the gleaming machete a death stroke against his nemesis, Horace P. Dumpler, head of the Alabama Department of Revenue, who was trying to put him out of business, or so he was convinced. Gordon B. Pumps gathered the cane in his arms and threw it into the back of his truck, then headed to his house in Point Clear, not far from the Grand Hotel. The hotel had been a fixture on its great spot of land since 1842 and was considered a queen of southern resorts. Gordon had unctuously befriended a desk clerk, knowing firsthand that Dumpler visited the hotel for a week every spring to play golf, at which he was basically no good since he was a hunchback, although he excelled at putting. He played in a foursome with several of his revenue agents. That's how Gordon had encountered him a year earlier. For 3 decades, Gordon had offered the public sightseeing trips into the exotic Mobile Tensaw River Delta, which was the second largest of its kind in the country and luxuriated in a diverse plethora of flora and fauna. Gordon had fished and hunted the Delta since he was a boy and knew as much, if not more, about it and its various features as anyone. He had a pleasant, folksy manner of speech, and some people went on his trips just to hear him talk. He had a few years back taken courses and received a degree in what amounted to swampology from a local university, and he considered what he did more than mere sightseeing. It was educational. That was where the rub with Dumpler came in. The previous year, while visiting the Grand Hotel, Dumpler had read a piece in the local newspaper on Gordon and his boat, and on a whim had booked a trip. The price was $80 per passenger, and Dumpler had graciously included his revenue agent's cum-golf foursome in the retinue. Everyone seemed fascinated as Gordon pointed out eagles' nests, eagles, cormorants, mergansers, herons, pelicans, snipes, wood ducks, ibis, alligators, nutria, wildcats, deer, feral hogs, possums, raccoons, various types of snakes, poisonous and otherwise, and turtles that sunned themselves on logs in the early spring. The revenue agents had asked questions about all this, but Dumpler's mind seemed to be elsewhere. Then, when Gordon cut off the engines to drift up on a flock of white pelicans, Dumpler broke the silence by proclaiming in a stentorian voice, "You must make a good living doing this." The pelicans, of course, flew off. Gordon was somewhat taken aback. "Not bad," he replied, "when the weather's good." "Well, let's see," said Dumpler. "Today, with us, you're making $320. If you have an afternoon trip, that's $640. I'd say that's better than not just bad." Like I said, there's a lot of days when I'm down because of weather. Since the pelicans had taken off, Gordon cranked up the engine. They'd been out a good 2 hours, so he headed back to the dock. Everybody left seemingly satisfied, and Gordon thought no more about these men until Monday morning, bright and early, at 7 a.m. in fact, when a woman wearing a purple pantsuit and a man's felt hat showed up at the dock as he was preparing the boat for an 8 o'clock trip. She said, "My name is Lucille Bratt, and I'm from the Alabama Department of Revenue." Gordon smiled politely and replied, "Pleased to meet you." Lucille Bratt got right to the point. "Are you paying your Alabama state entertainment tax?" "The what?" "The entertainment tax. It was passed by the state legislature 6 years ago." "Never heard of it," Gordon said. 10% of every dollar you take in," said Lucille Bratt. 10%? What for?" "You are entertaining people and they are paying for it. It's taxable." "Well, my business is more educational," Gordon told her. "There are 346 different birds in this delta, and I can spot every one of them from time to time." "Doesn't make any difference," the woman said. "People with these duck boat tours and those folks down at the Gulf who have the parasailing concession, everybody's got to pay it." "Well," Gordon said, flustered, I never heard of it. I've never heard any of the fishing guides mention it." "They got themselves exempted." Gordon stood there flabbergasted. Finally he said, "How did you come to be here telling me all this today?" "My boss brought it up." "And who would that be?" "Mr. Horace P. Dumpler, Commissioner of Revenue for the state of Alabama." "Dumpler? You mean the guy I took out last Friday?" "I guess so," Lucille responded. "He was the one who told me about you, said to tell you he had a nice time." She fumbled in her large handbag. "I've got these forms for you to fill out and sign. You'll have to pay the tax this year and back taxes for every year from the date the act was made into law." "I've what?" Gordon exclaimed. "It's the law," Lucille muttered resignedly. On the back steps, Gordon had taken out his $400 8-inch Shunhiro Hansuki butcher knife and was splitting the cane 4 ways from the top. He had already cut it into a dozen 16-inch pieces. He thought of Dumpler and sneered. When he had gone back 6 years to when the Alabama Entertainment Act was passed, he'd calculated that it would have amounted to approximately $28,000 in back taxes. Cash. That was on top of his federal income tax, his regular state income tax, sales tax, boat taxes, car taxes, etc., etc. He didn't have it. He would have to sell his boat. It would be the end of his business. He'd hired a lawyer, but nothing could be done. The unfairness of the exemption for the fishing guides rankled him as well. He was providing an educational service. He was 74 years old, and he was dispensing all the wealth of knowledge he had accumulated up in this delta since he was a boy of 8 and his father had taken him duck hunting. All his life, he tried to be a good citizen. Well, maybe in his drinking days he'd strayed from the narrow path, but those were long behind him. He'd always paid his taxes. He'd served honorably in the army in Vietnam, in combat, served his country, and now in his twilight years it was treating him thusly? A murderous scowl twisted Gordon's face. That low-life Dumpler, he thought, comes on my trip, accepts my hospitality, then turns on me like a snake. Now Gordon was sitting on the back steps of his house trailer, carefully shaving one end of each of the bamboo pieces. It was large, heavy bamboo, similar to the kind they had encountered in Vietnam. That was what had given him the idea, a punchy stake trap for that scumbag Dumpler. On the golf course, no less. It was an intricate plot, but rewarding in Gordon's mind. He'd seen a number of punji pits in Vietnam, about 3 feet square and 3 feet deep, camouflaged. He could dig that in a night. He would do it about 20 yards from the 11th hole on the Lakewood course, one of 2 18-hole courses that the hotel maintained. The plan was so ingenious that it gave Gordon a warm feeling inside, a premature sense of accomplishment. Number 11 was a short hole, and there was a bit of swamp alongside the fairway in which he could hide and watch both the tee and the lie of the ball. His dog Leslie, perhaps the best bird dog in the South, everybody said that about their quail dogs, was intricately involved. Having shaved each of the punji stakes to a point as fine or finer than the $400 Shunhiro Hansuki knife, he gathered the pieces and placed them in a preheated 375-degree oven where they would bake all night. In the morning, he would plunge them into a bucket of ice water, and when they had dried, they would be as razor-sharp and strong as the tempered steel in the Shunhiro. The Viet Cong dug punji pits on the trails everywhere Americans patrolled, and not a few soldiers were maimed and even died from their wounds. The bamboo stakes were so strong they would actually go through the soles of leather boots until the army wised up and put metal plates in the soles. But that didn't make patrolling any easier. The worst thing was that the Viet Cong smeared the tips of the stakes with human feces to create horrible and dangerous infections. That would be the finishing touch, Gordon thought, knowing full well where he would obtain the feces for that rat Horace Dumpler. There would be no steel plates in boots here, only flimsy golf shoes. Gordon rubbed his hands. While the steaks were baking in the oven, Gordon got into his truck with a shovel and drove to the Lakewood golf course of the Grand Hotel and trudged to the 11th hole, Dogwood Run, now bathed in the light of a silver 3/4 April moon. He'd already sighted in the spot for his pit and had brought a small wheelbarrow with him to dispose of the excess dirt. Leslie's role had been well rehearsed. He would hide in the swamp with Gordon until Horace Dumpler and his companions appeared on the 11th tee. It was a fairly long way off, but Gordon would be able to identify Dumpler because as a hunchback, he never used a driver or even irons. He always used his putter, even to tee off. That might seem ridiculous, but he'd perfected long putts up to 50 yards, and on a short hole, he could be on the green in 3 shots. Once there, he was deadly at the cup. Gordon had watched him every day since he'd arrived. At the cup, Horace Dumpler cleaned up. The trick was to watch and make sure Dumpler was up to drive or putt or whatever it was he did, and then when the ball got down close to the green and the punji pit, it was Leslie's time to go into action. On Gordon's signal, he would rush out and grab the ball and deposit it just on the far side of the punji pit so that Dumpler would have to address his shot by standing on the pit. Then, voila! For the time being, Gordon had put a piece of plywood over the hole, covered with leaves to disguise it. But as Dumpler's foursome neared, he would replace it with a light screen, camouflaged with leaves, which would immediately collapse when stood upon. He could picture Dumpler writhing in agony when he fell into the pit. One or more of the deadly stakes driven into his feet and legs, infection would begin immediately. Death, hopefully, would follow. The first of the foursome teed up his ball. He drove a shot that landed square in the fairway about 40 yards from the pit. Gordon held Leslie back by his collar, and he struggled to break free. The others took their turns, and then Dumpler addressed the ball with his putter. His first putt was straight down the middle of the fairway, but about 100 yards distant. Dumpler, in his peculiar crouch, ambled down from the green toward his ball. Apparently, it was the practice of the others to let their boss take more shots out of turn in order to catch up. Dumpler hit his putt, which rolled to a stop within 10 yards of the green and about 15 yards from the punji pit. Gordon released Leslie's collar, and he shot out from the edge of the swamp and scooped up Dumpler's ball with one smooth motion, turned and trotted over to the lip of the pit and dropped it on the ground. It all happened so fast that no one in Dumpler's party seemed to notice. That bastard, Gordon thought, probably has these clowns playing with him on taxpayer money. $100 green fee, 5 times a week, plus meals, drinks, rooms, tips, probably costing the taxpayers $5,000, maybe more, bastard. Dumpler approached his ball with a frown on his face. The others were standing around at the edges of the green, waiting. Gordon felt his throat tighten. Dumpler had carried his putter over his shoulder, but now swung it down as he reached the ball. He stood just beyond the leafy spot and scratched his ass, looking from the ball to the green. It seemed to Gordon that he could have used a 9-iron here, even with his hunchback crouch, but he kept to the putter. Dumpler took a step forward onto the top of the pit. As his foot was still in the air, Gordon caught his breath and grimaced. The foot hit the pit. Nothing happened. The other foot stood on the pit as well, and Dumpler addressed the ball. "Scheiße!" Gordon hissed and slapped his forehead. He had forgotten to remove the plywood and insert the screen. Dumpler made his putt, which rolled right up the slope and onto the green. He then hunched over the ball and knocked it right into the cup. The others began to nod and clap. Dumpler smiled. The golfing party moved on. Gordon sat at his kitchen table, steaming. It had been one of the dumbest mistakes he'd ever made, but he was determined to make up for it. Later that afternoon, he sidled up to one of the bellmen at the Grand Hotel and inquired what room Mr. Horace Dumpler was in. "I have a gift for him," Gordon told the man nicely. All through the cocktail hour and dinner, Gordon secretly watched the Dumpler party. After dinner, in the most expensive restaurant in the hotel, steaks and champagne all round, they repaired to Bucky's Birdcage Lounge for nightcaps. The men sat at the bar talking to several women, one of whom was, of all things, a dwarf, apparently on holiday. Gordon shook his head. He watched as long as he could, then snuck out and got his old golf bag, which he had left with the parking valet. Inside was a large, heavy, finely sharpened axe, a length of rope, an eye bolt, a small collapsible ladder, a measuring stick, a stud detector, a metal rod, a portable drill, and some light string. He hid in the bushes waiting for Dumpler and his friends to go by. It was close to midnight when he heard them coming. It was too dark to see, but they were headed back to their building, which was on the harbor where the boats were docked. 4th floor. They had adjoining rooms. Gordon gave it an hour and then went into action. He entered the building in the parking garage and took the elevator to the 4th floor. When he got to Dumpler's room, he put his ear to the door, dead to the world inside. He worked quickly, taking out the ladder, the drill, and the eye bolt. In the ceiling, Gordon made a small hole in a stud that was fortuitously directly in line with Dumpler's door. He used the metal rod to screw the eye bolt into the wood. "Bastard," he thought. "Probably wasted $1,000 more of the taxpayers' money tonight, and he wants to put me, an honest working man, out of business." Gordon used the measuring stick to cut the rope so that it would put the axe exactly 5 feet and 4 inches high in the doorway. That's how tall he figured Dumpler was. He tied the rope securely around the end of the axe handle and ran the rope through the eye bolt, winching the axe tightly against the ceiling. Then he affixed the light string to the end of the rope and put the ladder and the drill away. Gently, on tiptoes, Gordon tied the end of the string to the doorknob of Dumpler's room. He moved the golf bag around a corner, then marched up to Dumpler's door and banged on it 5 times with his fist. In a crack beneath the door, he could see a light come on, and then he heard a voice complain. Gordon stepped back into the shadows to watch the fun. The door opened, and as planned, that broke the string. This set the axe free in a huge swing around the center of the door, and whoever stood there, namely Horace P. Dumpler, would get the blade right in the center of his face. There was a muffled sound of locks being turned, and then the door sprung open. Simultaneously, the heavy axe, its razor-honed blade gleaming in the hallway ceiling lights, swung down toward the door. Gordon waited intently for the grisly thud. But this did not happen. Instead, the axe swung back and then back and forth several times before dangling to a rest in the middle of the hallway beneath the eyeball. Puzzled, Gordon stepped out of the shadows, and there in the doorway was the dwarf. Dumpler had apparently picked her up in the bar and brought her back to his room. The axe had swung a good 1.5 feet above her head. Scheisse, Gordon thought. How could I have known? Gordon followed Dumpler all that day and the next, trying to find an angle. He noted that at precisely 5 p.m., Dumpler visited the indoor swimming pool. He liked to dive, it turned out, and was fond of doing flips on the diving board. There was no lifeguard, and few other people visited that particular pool, as there were several outdoor heated pools they could go to. On the 3rd day, Gordon waited for Dumpler, hiding in some plants by the indoor pool. The revenue chief arrived exactly on time. The dwarf was with him. That could be a snag. She sat down in one of the lounge chairs beside the pool, but Dumpler took off his robe to reveal only a bathing suit. His hump gleamed like a polished dromedary's dome in the ceiling lights. Gordon slipped out into the hall and went to the reception desk. "Could you page a Mr. Horace Dumpler?" he asked innocently. The receptionist obliged, and Gordon sidled back toward the hallway where he saw Dumpler striding importantly through the doors leading to the reception desk. They passed quickly in the hall. Gordon deliberately stared at the wall, hoping Dumpler wouldn't recognize him. He didn't, though Dumpler did find something vaguely familiar about the encounter. Gordon walked quickly into the pool area and stripped off his shoes, pants, and shirt. Underneath, he had a bathing suit. He went straight to the diving board, clutching in his hand a bottle of Johnson's baby oil. He stepped out on the diving board, and there squeezed the contents as discreetly as possible onto the very end of the plank. Then he bounced once, held his nose, and went feet first into the warm, heated water. This ought to break his crooked neck, Gordon thought as he got out of the pool. Then he went over and engaged the dwarf in conversation. Dumpler returned looking puzzled, muttering something about strange things happening in the hotel. Seeing that the dwarf was engaged in conversation, he went immediately to the deep end of the pool, stepped up, and addressed the diving board. Measuring distance like a football place kicker, Dumpler backed all the way up and then ran forward. When he reached the end of the board, he hit the baby oil and took off in the air, sort of like Rocket Man. But instead of doing a half flip as Gordon had envisioned, landing on his head on the springing board, Dumpler did a complete flip and a half, landing on his ass on the end of the board, which then propelled him sproing straight up in the air once more for 2 additional flips before he hit the water in a kind of modified swan dive. Both Gordon and the dwarf, whose name was Lorraine, watched this spectacle speechlessly. Dumpler's head soon emerged from the water, and he cried, "By God, did you see that?" Lorraine began to clap and shout. Dumpler staggered up the steps and out of the pool into the waiting arms of his lover. They both jumped for joys. "I was 20 years in the circus, and I ain't never seen anything to match it," Lorraine exclaimed. Dumpler, noticing Gordon, said, "Say, haven't I seen you someplace?" Gordon stood for a moment, twisting his hands. "Well, yes, you have. I have the boat that takes people up in the Delta." "Oh, yes, of course." Dumpler extended his hand to Gordon, who shook it lightly. "Say, I'd like to take that trip again. I'm here till the end of the week. How about it?" "Well," Gordon replied. He was thinking. "My golf buddies have to go back on Friday, so it would just be me. I hope that's all right." Yes, certainly," Gordon told him. "You know what I liked about the last time?" Dumpler enthused. The alligators. I like the way they come out in the springtime, especially that big fellow. How big did you say he was? 17 feet, maybe a little longer. Nobody's been exactly able to measure him. My, said Dumpler. A man-eater, my. Yes, Gordon responded serenely now. Just meet me at the dock at 8 a.m., or should we make it 9? 8, Dumpler said. That last trip. Don't know when I've enjoyed myself more. Just you and me. Yes, Gordon smiled. Just you and me.